When the doll arrived at my lab, I never imagined the enigma it would become. For days, it remained inert, an uncanny but otherwise unremarkable artifact. No mechanism, no apparent magic, and certainly no voice. Yet, by the end of this investigation, I had not only seen it move, but had also heard it whisper warnings that linger still in my mind. 7 minutes of inexplicable animation, every 13 days. The implications were as chilling as they were perplexing. Initially, I grappled with rational possibilities. Hidden clockwork, electromagnetic interference, or even elaborate hoaxing. It wasn't until I unearthed its secrets, both physical and metaphysical, that the pieces began to fall into place. What I found was both fascinating and profoundly unsettling. This was no ordinary doll. It was a vessel, something trapped within it, something not entirely lifeless, nor entirely alive. I'm Dr. Imogen Grant, forensic pathologist and reluctant custodian of the inexplicable. My work at the Bethnal Archives straddles the boundary between science and the supernatural, dissecting truths hidden beneath layers of myth, ritual, and the grotesque. I came here 5 years ago, drawn by the promise of mysteries that defy logic and leave textbook answers crumpled in the corner. My role is to analyze the anatomy of the strange, whether that's cataloging the physiology of a cryptid or determining the origins of an artifact steeped in dark history. Despite my clinical detachment, the cases sometimes haunt me. There's a certain weight to encountering what shouldn't exist, and a fascination that keeps me tethered to this labyrinth of secrets. If you're here for tales of rational conclusions, you may be disappointed. But if you're here for the uneasy marriage of the empirical and the unexplainable, you've found the right archivist. But let's begin where all stories should, with the simple act of unpacking. The week the doll arrived, the archives were in turmoil. I don't just mean the usual chaos of cursed relics and haunted case files. There was something taut in the air, a collective wariness that seemed to permeate even the brick walls of our subterranean library. Edward Warrington, ever the polished and precise global affairs officer, had let his tie slide askew, a detail so small yet uncharacteristic that I felt compelled to offer comment. "Rough day?" I asked, carefully cataloging a case of preserved cryptid tissue samples. "Rough month," he muttered, rubbing at the corners of his eyes. Harker's got us all stretched thin. Another double shift. Another stack of incomplete dossiers. Honestly, Grant, I'd kill for a cup of decent tea, let alone 6 hours of uninterrupted sleep. "You and me both," I replied, though I knew his complaints wouldn't end there. Edward, bless him, always delivered his grievances like a particularly eloquent prosecutor, stacking them until you couldn't help but agree. Our conversation was cut short when Virgil barged in, looking distinctly worse for wear. His jacket bore the smudges of soot and damp, his jaw set in a grimace that warned against small talk. "Your favorite Stanton," he growled, dropping a battered cardboard box onto my workstation. "Sent you another treasure. Lucky you." I raised an eyebrow, slipping off my gloves to inspect the package. "Is this where I'm supposed to thank you for braving the horrors of East End basements?" "Save the gratitude," he muttered, already halfway out the door. "I'm not in the mood, and don't say I didn't warn you." Edward, watching this exchange with a faint smirk, offered a dry quip about Virgil's sunny disposition before making his own exit. I was left alone with the package, its corners damp, its tape loose and streaked with grime. Inside, nestled amid soggy newspaper, lay the doll. At first glance, it appeared unremarkable, albeit unsettling. The porcelain was finely crafted, its painted features suggesting Victorian origins. Wide, glassy blue eyes stared unblinking from beneath a crown of brittle blonde curls, their gaze unsettlingly direct even in repose. Its yellowed lace dress exuded a faint scent of lilac, a chemical ghost of whatever sachet or perfume had once adorned it. But under the lab's stark fluorescent lights, the cracks became evident. Quite literally. A hairline fissure ran diagonally across the face, bisecting the porcelain from temple to cheek. One hand bore a jagged chip along its index finger, a detail that snagged against my glove as I turned it over. What struck me most, however, was its weight, disproportionate for an object its size. It wasn't the density of solid porcelain, nor the telltale balance of a clockwork interior. Something inside the doll shifted slightly when handled, a faint rattle, barely audible. A note accompanied the artifact, written in hurried, slanted script. She moves every 13 days for 7 minutes. Take care. Notes like this aren't uncommon. We see them scribbled on the backs of receipts, tucked into files, or hastily scrawled by people desperate to pass their problems to us. I photographed the doll, logged it under Delta 4 for cursed artifacts, and prepared it for observation. Cameras surrounded its sealed chamber, with heat sensors, pressure monitors, and an electromagnetic field detector positioned to catch any anomalies. For 13 days, the doll remained still. It happened at precisely midnight on the 13th day. I was mid-dissection of a preserved cryptid specimen, a feathered appendage with unusual ossification patterns, when the alert sounded. Movement detected. I glanced at the live feed, expecting nothing more than an ambient shift, perhaps from vibrations in the building. What I saw was the doll's head turning. The motion was disturbingly smooth, far too fluid for something so rigid, as though the porcelain itself had momentarily softened, relinquishing its brittle nature. The doll's head turned with the unnatural grace of a predator tracking prey, its movements eerily deliberate. It rotated to face the camera directly, tilting slightly, as though adjusting its angle to ensure it was seen. Its glassy eyes seemed alive in that moment, reflecting the dim glow of the observation chamber, but holding an unsettling depth, like dark water that conceals something waiting beneath the surface. It wasn't just looking at the camera. It was looking through it, as though aware of the observer on the other side. Then, with excruciating slowness, one fragile porcelain hand rose, its chipped finger trembling as it lifted. The motion wasn't jerky or robotic. It carried an awful semblance of intent, each second drawn out until the air felt thick and oppressive. The hand paused midway, hovering before its face, then extended fully to press against its lips in a shushing gesture that felt more like a warning than a plea. The chipped edge of the finger rested perfectly, unnervingly, against the painted line of its mouth, emphasizing the too dark stain of its lips. For 7 minutes, it held that position. The entire room seemed to bow under the weight of its silence. The cameras captured no sound beyond the faint hum of the equipment, but I swear the stillness had its own presence, a pressing, suffocating quiet that wrapped itself around the chamber and seeped into my skin. I stared, unwilling to blink, as though any lapse in focus might allow it to shift again unnoticed. Its unblinking eyes remained locked on the camera, on me, as though daring me to look away. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, the animation ceased. The doll collapsed into its original posture with a brittle finality, the once smooth movement replaced by the static, lifeless pose of a fragile artifact. It looked no different than it had before, just a doll, inert and harmless. Yet I couldn't shake the feeling that it hadn't simply gone still. It had chosen to stop, as though it had completed whatever unseen task it had set out to perform. I replayed the footage obsessively. There was no sign of external manipulation, no string or magnetic interference. What's more, the room's ambient temperature had dropped significantly during the event. But it was the audio that chilled me most. Faint whispers, barely perceptible beneath the hum of the equipment, began shortly after the doll moved. When isolated and amplified, they revealed fragments of a phrase. She sees 7 to 7. Beware. The next day, Felix joined me in the lab. While he lacks the clinical precision I bring to our cases, his expertise in occult symbology is unmatched. Together, we examined the footage, the audio, and finally, the doll itself. Under ultraviolet light, we discovered faint markings along the hairline, symbols associated with summoning and containment rituals. There's something in it, Felix murmured, his voice unusually subdued. Something bound. Closer inspection revealed a concealed compartment beneath the porcelain shell, sealed with what appeared to be wax. I spent hours carefully removing the layers, using delicate instruments to avoid damaging the artifact. Inside, I found a blackened fragment of parchment. The sigils scrawled across it were crude but unmistakable, a binding spell, incomplete and deteriorating. I felt a strange mixture of triumph and dread. Whatever this doll was, it wasn't simply cursed. It was a vessel. The second activation came 13 days later. This time, I observed directly, standing behind reinforced glass with a recording device and a ward etched into a pendant around my neck. The doll began to move as the clock struck midnight. It turned its head, raised its hand, and then tapped lightly against the glass. The whispers were louder now. They filled the room, overlapping and echoing. Release me. Beware the seven. My pulse quickened. Against every rational instinct, I spoke. What are you? The doll froze mid-movement, its head snapping toward an empty corner of the chamber. The voice that followed wasn't a whisper. It was a rasping, hollow sound, as though pulled from the depths of a long-abandoned well. Hollow. The doll now resides in a vault beneath layers of wards and reinforced glass. Felix insists it's safely contained. Virgil mutters about Stanton's knack for trouble. And Edward, wary as ever, says we've got bigger problems to worry about. But I can't stop thinking about its final warning. Beware the seven. 7 what? 7 days? 7 people? 7 chances? The words loop in my mind, unwelcome guests that refuse to leave. At first, I tried to distract myself, throwing myself into other cases and autopsies, anything to drown out the creeping unease. Days passed in an almost mechanical blur. I dissected preserved specimens, analyzed cursed artifacts, and filed endless reports for the interim director's insatiable appetite for documentation. And yet, no matter how busy I kept my hands, my thoughts always circled back to those whispered words. It wasn't until the 5th day that Virgil turned up unannounced, his signature gruffness filling the lab like a cold draft. Without so much as a greeting, he tossed an old, leather-bound diary onto my desk. "Stanton thought you might need this," he said, leaning against the doorframe with his usual nonchalance. "You're welcome, by the way." I raised an eyebrow, glancing at the journal. It was battered and worn, its corners soft from age, and it smelled faintly of mildew and soot. The leather cover bore no markings, no title or name to hint at its origins. "What's this supposed to be?" "Dunno," Virgil replied, shrugging, "but he said it might be related to your creepy little doll. Figured you'd want it." He left before I could question him further, leaving me alone with the enigmatic diary and a nagging sense of foreboding. That night, I finally opened it, half expecting pages filled with rambling entries or obscure notes. But the diary was blank, every page pristine and untouched, as if it had never been used. Frustrated, I flipped through it again, scrutinizing each sheet for any indentations or faint traces of ink. Nothing. I was ready to dismiss it as another dead end when the idea struck me. Grabbing the UV light I kept for examining blood residues and other biological traces, I swept it across the first page. Symbols leapt into view under the fluorescent glow, faint, spidery marks that spread across the paper like veins. They were intricate, almost like hieroglyphics, but not quite. Something about them tugged at my memory, a sense of familiarity that I couldn't immediately place. I spent the better part of an hour cross-referencing the archive's symbol database, but nothing matched. Frustration set in until I remembered the secured government system the archives had access to. An experimental database cataloging ancient and esoteric scripts. Felix once called it overkill, but in this moment, it felt like salvation. The database took an eternity to load, its security protocols grinding through multiple verifications. But when it finally opened, I began the search. The symbols weren't Egyptian or Mesopotamian as I'd first suspected. Instead, they bore striking similarities to early Anglo-Saxon runes, but with distinct deviations that hinted at something older, something deliberately altered. The system flagged the script as Variant Anglo-Saxon, a rare and poorly documented form tied to ritualistic practices. The sparse notes associated with the entry suggested its use in protective wards, specifically containment spells. The realization made my stomach churn. This diary wasn't just blank pages. It was a record of something bound, something that might explain the doll's cryptic warning. But why Stanton, or whoever had passed this to Virgil, thought I needed it remained unclear. I turned the page, scanning for more symbols, more fragments to piece together. And there they were. Each page unveiled under UV light, a sprawling collection of runes and symbols, each one more intricate and foreboding than the last. As the night wore on, the unease settled deeper into my bones. The diary wasn't just a clue, it was a key. But the question remained, a key to what? And how long did I have before the 7 made itself known? The next morning, I summoned Edward Warrington to my lab. He arrived, looking marginally better than he had earlier in the week, though still frayed at the edges. A mug of something steaming, likely his 3rd cup of the day, sat in his hand, and his usual precision returned as he adjusted his tie and peered at the diary under the UV light. "Interesting," he murmured, his tone carefully neutral, though I caught the flicker of intrigue in his eyes. "These symbols, they're an odd variant of Anglo-Saxon runes. I haven't seen anything quite like them, but the deviations suggest a specific purpose. Ritualistic, perhaps. Protective wards, maybe even a binding spell," I offered, recounting my findings from the previous night. "But it's not just the runes. There's something else. The phrasing in some sections, it's fragmented, almost like it's recounting a story." Edward settled into the chair across from me, flipping carefully through the illuminated pages. His eyes sharpened as he pieced together the fragments, his fingers tracing the faded symbols. He read aloud, the words coming haltingly at first, then with growing confidence. "It tells the story of a child," Edward began. "A girl who lived in a village on the edge of what would have been Anglo-Saxon territory. The records are murky, but it seems her family, her parents and siblings, were slaughtered during a raid. The Saxons spared her, though the reasons are unclear. Perhaps she was too young to be a threat, or perhaps they meant to use her for ransom. Either way, they kept her captive as they celebrated their victory." I leaned forward, the clinical part of my brain cataloging every detail as Edward continued. "She bided her time," he said, his voice steady but low, as though unwilling to disturb the oppressive weight of the narrative. "The story says she fell into a kind of madness, driven by grief and rage. On the night the raiders drank themselves to stupor, she acted. One by one, she slit their throats as they slept, using a blade taken from one of their own. But it wasn't just vengeance." Edward hesitated, his eyes flicking up to meet mine, his expression grave. "She didn't just kill them, she consumed them." The air in the lab seemed to thicken, the sterile scent of chemicals suddenly cloying. "Consumed them," I repeated, my voice quieter than I intended. "You mean cannibalized," Edward confirmed. "The text describes it as something unnatural, not an act of desperation, but one of insatiable hunger. The soldiers awoke to find their comrades dead or half-eaten. The ones who tried to stop her spoke of a frenzy, of wounds that should have felled her but didn't. They called it a blood rage, and it said she fought like a beast possessed." I could feel my pulse quicken as Edward turned another page, his voice growing darker with the tale. "Eventually, they subdued her. It took nearly the entire surviving force to pin her down, and even then she tore at them with her teeth. They couldn't kill her by ordinary means. Every blade and strike seemed to feed her rage. So they burned her alive." "And that was the end of her?" I asked, though I suspected the answer. "Not quite," Edward said grimly. Her ashes were gathered, though no one knows by whom. The story diverges into myth here. Some accounts say the ashes were scattered, others that they were used in dark rituals. But there's a peculiar footnote in the archives, Anglo-Saxon folktales, one that caught my attention years ago but seemed too far-fetched to warrant much thought. It mentioned the ashes of a so-called Blood Maiden. Blood Maiden? I echoed. The term was unfamiliar, but it sent a chill skittering across my skin. A rudimentary form of what you might call a vampire, Edward explained. But unlike the romanticized vampires of later folklore, this was a creature of primal hunger, a predator born of human suffering and rage. The folktale suggested that, centuries later, her ashes had been recovered during the Victorian era. Victorian? I frowned. That's an odd leap. Edward nodded, tapping the diary with his index finger. It is, but there's more. According to the story, the ashes were mixed into porcelain, a bizarre and malicious act by a jealous woman who wanted to curse her husband's illegitimate daughter. The porcelain was used to create a doll, one imbued with the Blood Maiden's lingering essence. If what Virgil brought you is truly that doll. My stomach turned at the realization. Then the spirit isn't just bound to it, it's alive in some way. Alive, yes, or at least aware, Edward said. And if this really is the Blood Maiden, the warning you heard, beware the seven, might not be a warning at all. It could be a countdown, I finished, the words falling from my lips like lead. Edward nodded gravely, his expression dark. The seventh activation might not just be her awakening. It could be her release. The lab fell silent, the weight of the possibility settling over us. If Edward was right and this doll was truly the cursed vessel of a creature born of bloodlust and rage, then the danger wasn't just theoretical. It was imminent. And the 7 minutes of motion might only be the beginning. The doll will awaken again, and when it does, I'll be ready, or as ready as anyone can be to face the unknown. Before I sign off, I should mention that Joe, one of our interns, insisted I end this with a thank you. He said something about engaging with the audience, and how I ought to show a bit more appreciation for those of you who willingly immerse yourselves in the peculiar chaos of the archives. So thank you for listening, for sharing in these mysteries, and for daring to walk with us on the line between the explainable and the unexplainable. Joe assures me it's important to acknowledge that, in a world filled with ordinary noise, you've chosen to tune into our strange little corner. I suspect he's hoping this will make you all like me more, but really, I think it's him who's vying for your favor. In any case, until next time, keep questioning, keep listening, and if you see a doll with glassy blue eyes, don't keep it around long enough to learn its secrets. Trust me, you'll thank me later.